Alright, this video is going to help us with making our own circle graphs with the blue templates that were provided in the class. Alright, the first thing you need to know is that a circle graph compares data by showing the parts of a whole. So when you have this circle, this represents one whole. And if you take any piece or any fraction, we're always going to compare those in percents with circle graphs. So you'll always get a set of data, and it will be shown in percent. And the one thing you have to make sure is that every single item or category that you have adds up to 100%. If I look at 45% car, 20% SUV, 30% bus, 5% walk, this is all data about transportation to school for fifth graders, but it should all equal 100%. If it does not, then you're not given the correct data. And I look at this, and yes, it does. These all add up to 100%. So, in order to take all of these categories and put them in my circle graph, I need to show that out of 100%, 45% is represented on here, 20% is represented on the circle, 30% is represented on the circle, and 5% is represented on the circle. The most difficult thing about this is that you can't overlap. You can't have a set of data in two spots, and I'll show you what I mean in a second. So, if we're going to take all these percents, let's look at car first. 45%. We're going to use car to start with. 45% of fifth grade students travel by car to get to school. So, the first thing you need to do is you need to look at your circle graph and you need to put your template down. And make sure that you have this circle here with all these little notches on it, and it has percentages on it. That'll help you. Your 0% has to be facing up. That's going to be our central starting spot. Okay? And you have to try and guesstimate where the center of your circle is. Then line up your template with the spot that you just marked, and then look what your 0% says, and it should be lined up to the top. I'll put a little marking here so I know that this represents 0%. When I take away my template, that marking is there, and that's straight in my central starting point of my circle graph is there as well. So I'll line this up, and all I have to do is draw from the centermost part of the circle and go out, okay, to the outermost part of the circle right there. Even though my mark is up here, I don't need to go all the way out there. I know that this is still going to be the same within the circle. And I could go back and I could erase that mark if I wanted to. And this represents 0%. Now let's look back at our data that was given, and our first category is car, 45%. So I need to mark 45% car on this circle. I'll go back up and line up my 0% with the centermost part of the circle. As you can see, it goes from 0%, 5%, 10%, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, 40. Up, 45 is right here. So on the little tick mark, I guess you would call it, where it says 45%, you're going to put another little line right here. Now I know from this 0% all the way over to this line here, this is representing 45% of the circle graph. So I'm going to move that, and I'm going to draw a line. Even though my line goes outside of the circle, I do not have to go and connect to this dot here. I'll go to the centermost part of the circle, make sure it's lined up with the mark I just made, and draw a line going to the outermost part of the circle graph. Now, I know that this represents 45% for the car, so I'm going to write 45% car. And I know that because 50% would be split down the middle. And if you can look, this is a little bit less than 50%, so it's 45%. So that's an accurate way to tell. Alright, I am done with car, so I'm going to check it off. Now I have to go with the SUV, 20%. This is where I think we got a little confused in class. 20%, I cannot go back and put my template on my circle graph starting with 0 and go to 20%, which is right here. Why? Because if I put a mark right here, that's going to overlap from 0% to 20%. So this area is already taken up by the car. So I'm going to shade this in just to help myself out. And I know that this whole entire space is taken up. So I have to do a little bit of math. I know that this line right here goes all the way up to 45%. Well, I want to represent 20% in this white space over here that's left with my circle graph. So I know that 45 plus 20 would be 65%. So I'm going to go back and put my template on the circle graph, and if I go, yep, 45% was my last marking. If I go up to 65%, which is right here, and put a mark, I know that from 45% to 65% is going to represent 20% of my circle graph. So I can remove my template. I can draw a line right from here to that marking that I just made to the outermost part of this circle. So once again, I'll stop right here. And now I know that this is going to be 20% SUV. And I'm going to shade it in because I cannot overlap and this space is already taken up. And just to help me out a little bit, I'm going to put 65% out here because when I go to do math again, it'll be a little bit easier instead of backtracking. Alright, so the SUV 20% is done. Now I have bus 30%. Well, if I just left off at 65%, I know that if I add another 30%, that would take me up to 95%. So let's put the template back on here. 0%. And 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, all the way around. I left off here. 65, 75, 85. Here's 95%, right about here. So I know if I go from 65%, where I just left off, to 95%, 65 plus 30% would be 95%, and that's my next number, bus, 30%. So if I remove this, I'm going to, once again, draw another line from the center to the mark that I just made, and I know that this is 30% bus. And I don't really have to put my template back on for the last and final part. Walk would be 5%. Well, I know that because this is 95%. 65 plus 30% would equal 95%. Well, what would get you to 100 or the whole representation? 95 plus what's left, 5%, would get you back to your starting point right here. And I know that all this is going to be shaded in for the bus 30%, and the 5% will also be shaded in. And this is how you use your template to mark or to make circle graphs. Remember, circle graphs are always represented in percents, and it compares data by showing the parts of a whole, always in percentages.